Part 1. The bargain. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened to my brother. He was not a bad person before he got sick. I know that's what everyone says about people who eventually do terrible things, that they were good once, that something changed them, that the person you're reading about now is not the person they were. I know how hollow that sounds. I'm asking you to believe it anyway, because it matters to how this story ends, and because the alternative, believing that what happened to Elliot was always inside him waiting, is something I cannot afford to believe and still live with what I did. Elliot was 34 when the diagnosis came. I was 31. We'd grown up close in the way siblings grow close when there's not much else around, a small house, parents who worked long hours, a neighborhood that offered entertainment only if you were creative enough to find it. Elliot had been the creative one. He'd had the kind of mind that found connections between things, that saw the mechanism behind the surface of events, that could take a broken thing apart and understand it well enough to put it back together differently and better. He'd gone into medicine because of it, become a diagnostician at a hospital in the city, the kind of doctor other doctors consulted when they'd run out of explanations. The irony of what happened to him was not lost on either of us. The disease was rare enough that even Elliot, with all his knowledge and all his contacts, took 3 months to get a definitive diagnosis. By then it had progressed past the point where the standard interventions were likely to help. The doctors, his colleagues, people who respected him, people who knew what they were dealing with because he'd taught some of them, were honest with him in the way doctors are honest with other doctors, which is to say more honest than most people want to be told. He had, they said, perhaps 18 months, perhaps less. I watched him receive this information with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his career delivering similar news to other people and has spent that career being quietly grateful it wasn't him. The stillness lasted about 4 days. Then something in him shifted, in the way that something shifts in a person when the thing they'd always known, abstractly, becomes suddenly and completely real. And Elliot stopped being still. He started looking for alternatives. I don't mean he sought second opinions or enrolled in clinical trials, though he did those things too. I mean he started looking in places his scientific training should have told him not to look, with a thoroughness that frightened me because thoroughness had always been his most reliable quality, and seeing it applied to things that should not have been taken seriously suggested how seriously he was taking his own mortality. He came to me 6 months after the diagnosis, thinner than he'd been, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to conserve energy. He sat in my kitchen and told me he'd found something. Found what? I asked. He put a photograph on my kitchen table, an aerial image printed from a satellite source showing a fold in a mountain range I didn't recognize. In the fold, barely visible under the tree cover, the suggestion of structures. Stone, possibly, old. A place, he said. People have been going there for a long time. Not tourists. Not hikers. He paused. People who needed something. I looked at the photograph. Elliot, I know what it sounds like, he said. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm asking you to drive me there. I drove him there. It took 2 days to reach the mountains. Another half day on roads that became progressively less road-like, and then 4 hours on foot through forest, so dense that the light came through in isolated shafts rather than general illumination. Elliot moved slowly but steadily, and he didn't complain. And I didn't say any of the things I wanted to say because the set of his jaw told me he'd already had every version of this argument with himself and had arrived at the same destination regardless. The ruins were older than I had words for. Not the theatrical oldness of buildings preserved for tourism, the careful crumbling of things maintained in their crumbling for aesthetic effect. The genuine oldness of structures that had been built for purposes nobody living remembered, in a style that suggested a way of organizing space that didn't match any architectural tradition I could identify. The stones fitted together without mortar in patterns that seemed to follow a logic I couldn't follow. There was no one there. The ruins were empty, as far as I could tell, and in the failing afternoon light they sat in their clearing, with the particular quality of places that have been empty for a very long time and have developed their own relationship with emptiness, a settled, inhabited quality to the silence that had nothing to do with people. Elliot walked through the ruins without hesitation, like someone following directions they'd memorized. He went to the center of the largest structure, a circular arrangement of stones around a depression in the earth that might have been a well or might have been something else entirely. He stood at the edge of the depression for a long time. I stood at the entrance to the structure and watched him, and I felt something I have felt very few times in my life, the specific, physical sensation of being in a place where the ordinary rules of things did not fully apply. Not a supernatural feeling exactly, more like standing at a very high altitude, where the air is thin enough that your body registers the difference before your mind has processed it, where something fundamental to the environment is subtly wrong in a way that is not dangerous, but is unmistakably present. Elliot reached into his jacket pocket and took out something small. I couldn't see what it was from where I stood. He held it over the depression for a moment, and then he released it, and it fell, and the sound it made when it hit the bottom was wrong, too deep, too resonant, as if the depression was much deeper than it appeared, as if whatever it contained was much further down than the physical dimensions of the stone structure should have allowed. We left before dark, Elliot's face unreadable, neither of us speaking about what had happened or what he dropped into the depression or what he expected to follow from it on the drive home. Somewhere on a mountain road in the dark, he fell asleep in the passenger seat, and I drove and listened to his breathing and told myself that whatever he'd needed from that place, whatever comfort or closure or last act of agency, he'd gotten it, and we could now focus on the months we had left and spend them well. 3 weeks later, his doctors couldn't find any trace of the disease. Part 2. The change. I want to be precise about the timeline, because the timeline matters. The first follow-up scan showed significant reduction in the disease markers. The second, 6 weeks after that, showed them effectively gone. His medical team used words like spontaneous remission and anomalous recovery, in the careful tones of people who need to say something and have nothing accurate to say. Elliot listened to their explanations with an expression I couldn't read and didn't ask questions. He went back to work 3 months after the ruins. The hospital welcomed him back with the particular warmth that institutions extend to people who've survived something unlikely, the warmth of relief mixed with the slight discomfort of people who'd already begun mentally redistributing his responsibilities and now had to redistribute them back. I visited him at the hospital 6 weeks. After his return, the change was not dramatic. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain it to people who weren't there. The change was not dramatic. Not at first, and that was exactly what made it so difficult to name. Elliot had always been precise, measured, economical with his attention. He'd had a way of assessing situations and people quickly and accurately, and then allocating exactly as much engagement as warranted, no more and no less. It was one of his best qualities as a doctor. It had sometimes made him seem cold. What I noticed in the hospital that day was not coldness. It was something else. The precision was still there, but it had been redirected, oriented differently, toward something I couldn't identify. He moved through the ward with his usual authority, but the authority had a different quality, denser, more absolute, as if it came from somewhere other than his training and experience and professional reputation. The nurses noticed it, too. I watched them when they didn't know I was watching, and their response to Elliot was not the comfortable professional deference of people working with a respected colleague. It was something else, something closer to the behavior of people in the presence of someone whose good will they are not entirely certain of. I told myself I was imagining it. Over the following months, Elliot began to change in ways that were still individually explainable and collectively alarming. He worked longer hours. He took on more cases than his position required. He developed an interest in the administrative structures of the hospital that seemed inconsistent with his previous focused disinterest in anything that wasn't direct patient care. He cultivated relationships with the hospital board, with the senior administration, with the various department heads, with a strategic thoroughness that I recognized as characteristic of him, but had never before seen applied to institutional power. I had dinner with him 4 months after his return. We met at a restaurant we'd been going to for years, a comfortable habit of an evening. He was on time, well-dressed, visibly healthy in a way that still occasionally struck me as slightly shocking, given where we'd been a year before. "You seem different," I said. Because I'd decided to say it directly, he looked at me across the table. "I went through something significant," he said. "People change after significant experiences." "It's not that," I said. "Or not only that." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was the same, but something in its quality had shifted slightly, like a radio station that's drifted a fraction off its frequency. "I feel better than I have in years, Nate, better than I can remember feeling. Whatever happened to me, whatever happened in that place, it worked. Can't we leave it at that? What did you put in that hole?" I asked Dot. He smiled. It was Elliot's smile, exactly Elliot's smile, and it didn't reach his eyes in a way that I had never noticed before because it always had. "Something I could afford to lose," he said. I did not pursue it. I told myself it was because he was right, that the outcome was what mattered, that whatever he'd sacrificed for his survival was between him and whatever he believed had accepted it. The truth, which I understood only later, was that I was afraid of the answer, and I had enough of my own complicity in what had happened to make the fear easy to rationalize. Part 3. The spreading 8 months after Elliot's return to work, things at the hospital began to go wrong in ways that were difficult to see clearly from outside. I heard about it in pieces. A colleague of Elliot's who'd known him for years called me one evening, uncomfortable and apologetic, asking if everything was all right with Elliot personally, if he was under any particular stress, if I'd noticed anything unusual. I asked what had prompted the call and received a careful, diplomatic answer that I understood underneath the diplomacy to mean, something has changed in how he operates and we don't know what it is, but it is affecting the people around him, and we don't know what to do about it. I started visiting the hospital more frequently. What I saw there, across a series of visits over the following weeks, was not dramatic enough to act on and too consistent to dismiss. The ward where Elliot worked had developed a particular quality. The staff who'd been there longest moved through it with a kind of subdued efficiency that looked like professionalism but felt, when I observed it closely enough, more like the behavior of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves. The newer staff, recent hires, interns, people who joined in the last several months moved differently, more aligned with Elliot's rhythms, more oriented toward him, not in the normal way of junior staff deferring to a senior colleague, in a way that had an almost physical quality to it, as if their attention was being drawn toward him by something other than professional hierarchy. Patients recovered unusually well under Elliot's care. This was on the surface exactly what you wanted from a doctor. His recovery rates were exceptional, better than they'd been even before his illness, better than anyone else at the hospital. The cases he took on, many of which had been abandoned by other physicians as untreatable, resolved with a consistency that attracted attention from the hospital administration in ways that were entirely positive. I asked one of the recovered patients, an older man I encountered in the hospital corridor, how he was feeling. He looked at me with an expression of distant contentment and said that he felt better than he'd felt in years. I asked what he attributed his recovery to. He said Dr. Elliot had given him something. I asked what Elliot had given him. He looked confused, as if the question didn't quite parse, and said again that Dr. Elliot had given him something, and then he smiled the same smile Elliot had given me at dinner, the one that didn't reach the eyes, and walked away down the corridor. I went to Elliot's office that afternoon and told him what I'd observed, as clearly and specifically as I could. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his expression attentive and entirely unreadable. When I finished, he said, "You're worried about me." "I'm worried about the people in this hospital. They're better," he said, "measurably, verifiably better. Their outcomes are better. Their quality of life is better. What are you doing to them, Elliot?" He looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment, for the first time, I saw something look back from behind my brother's eyes that was not my brother. Not fully. Not entirely. Something that had been present for months, and that I had refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it would have required me to acknowledge what I'd driven him to, what I'd made possible by taking him to that clearing in the mountains. Sharing, he said, what was given to me. He paused. It can be shared, Nate. That's the remarkable thing. It wants to be shared. I left the hospital. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. Then I called a number I'd found 3 weeks earlier After the first visit from Elliot's colleague, when something had told me to start looking for something I wasn't yet able to name, the person who answered said very little. They told me to come to an address. They told me to come alone. Part 4. The people who knew the address was a building in an unremarkable part of the city, the kind of building that has been repurposed several times and bears the traces of its previous uses in ways that make it look temporary even when it isn't. The room I was shown to was bare, except for a table and several chairs, and the 3 people who were already seated there, when I arrived, looked like people who had been having versions of this conversation for a long time and had stopped being surprised by new participants. They knew about Elliot before I said his name. They knew about the ruins. They knew about the depression in the center of the circular structure, and what it was, and approximately what Elliot had dropped into it, though they were not precise about this last point in a way that suggested they knew more than they were saying. What they told me over the following hours, I will summarize as accurately as I can. The entity that had made its way into Elliot through the ruins was old in a way that the word old doesn't adequately cover. It existed in a different relationship to time than anything in our experience, a relationship that made its age in our terms essentially meaningless. It had been aware of the ruins and what they represented for longer than the ruins themselves had existed. The ruins were not its origin. They were a threshold, one of several, places where the conditions that allowed it to interact with our world were sufficiently present to make contact possible, but it did not want to destroy. That was the first thing they wanted me to understand. The popular conception of entities like this one, malevolent, destructive, consuming, was, they said, a misunderstanding based on limited perspective. It wanted to extend itself into our world, to be present here, to experience what our world offered in terms it could not access from where it existed. It had found over many attempts across many centuries that the most effective method was not force but invitation, finding people who needed something badly enough to accept help from a source they didn't understand, and using that transaction as a foothold. Elliot's body was a foothold. The people in the hospital were secondary footholds. The entity was patient. It was not in a hurry. It had been trying to establish a stable presence in our world for longer than our civilization had existed, and it had learned from each attempt. It was not making the mistakes it had made before. Can it be stopped? I asked Dot, the woman across the table from me, the one who'd spoken most clearly, who had the manner of someone who had been doing this specific kind of work for a very long time, said, "Stopped entirely? No. Not by us. Not by anything available to us." "Then what? The connection can be severed," she said. "The foothold can be removed. If the original transaction is reversed, if what was given is returned and the exchange is unmade, the entity loses its point of entry. It doesn't die. It doesn't go away. It goes back to where it was." "How?" She put a folder on the table. Inside the folder were photographs of ruins. Different ruins, different locations, different periods of history, but the same essential structure, the same circular arrangement of stones, the same depression in the center. The original transaction has to be unmade at the point of transaction, she said. At the ruins, and it has to be unmade by the person who made it, or by someone acting with their consent and on their behalf. Eliot will never consent to that, I said. He knows what it would mean. He'll never go back voluntarily. She looked at me with an expression that had a great deal of patience in it, and a great deal of sorrow, and very little surprise. No, she said. He won't. She told me what I would need. She told me where to find it. She told me what to expect when I went back to the ruins, and what to do when I was there. She told me, at the end, that the probability of surviving what I was planning was not high, and that I should understand this clearly before I committed to it. I told her I understood. I don't think I did. Not really. I think I have the understanding you have when you're told something abstractly terrible, the intellectual comprehension without the full physical weight of it. I understand it now. The understanding I have now is of the kind that comes after, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, in the places where the body remembers things the mind would prefer to forget. Part 5. The return I had 2 weeks before. Eliot's influence would extend beyond the hospital in ways that could not be contained. The woman had been clear about this timeline and about what it meant if the timeline was exceeded. I spent those 2 weeks preparing and watching Eliot and trying not to let him see that I was watching. He knew something had changed in my behavior. I could see him assessing me in the way he'd always assessed things, quickly, accurately, reaching conclusions with a speed that was no longer entirely his own. He didn't confront me. He was more careful than that now. He simply moved around me with a deliberateness that told me he was aware of what I was considering and was calculating how much of an obstacle I represented. The night before I went back to the ruins, I came to the hospital. I found Eliot in his office at midnight, as I'd known I would. He'd been spending more and more time in the hospital, less and less time in his apartment, as if the connection between the institution and the entity was requiring his physical presence to maintain. He looked up when I came in, and for a moment his face showed something that was genuinely Eliot, recognition, something close to relief. The specific expression of a person seeing someone they love before the other thing reasserted itself, and the expression went neutral. "You're going back," he said. Yes, he was quiet. Outside his office window, the hospital was its night-time self, reduced to the essential sounds of a building that never fully sleeps. "It won't work," he said. Not a threat, a statement of what he believed to be fact. Maybe not. And if it does, he stopped, started again. What I am now, Nate, what I can do. The people I've helped. That disappears. The people you've changed, I said. Not helped. He looked at me with an expression that might have been anger or might have been grief, that occupied the space between those two things where they become difficult to distinguish. "I was dying," he said. "You drove me there." "I know," I said. We looked at each other across the desk, and I think in that moment something of the real Eliot was present, something that hadn't been fully overwritten yet, that still remembered what we were to each other before all of this. His face did something complicated and then went still. "I can't let you do it," he said. "I know that, too." What happened in the next few minutes I will not describe in detail, partly because some of it I don't fully remember, and partly because the parts I do remember are not the kind of thing that translates well into language. I will say that I had been told what to expect from someone in Elliot's condition when physically confronted, and that the preparation was adequate, but only barely, and that I left his office and the hospital moving quickly, and that Elliot did not follow me into the parking garage. He sent others instead. Not staff, not the people from the ward. Something else. Something that moved through the city that night at the edges of my perception, in the shadows between street lights, with a motion that was not quite consistent with the physics of how bodies move, drove through the night and into the morning and into the mountains. Part 6. The unmaking the ruins in the morning light looked smaller than I remembered. Ruins often do on return visits. The memory expands them, gives them the dimensions of the feelings they provoked, and the physical reality is always a reduction of that. I stood at the entrance to the circular structure with what the woman had given me and felt the same wrongness in the air as before, the same thinness, the same suggestion that the ordinary rules were differently applied here. The depression in the center looked the same, dark, deeper than it should have been. I became aware, standing there, that I was not alone, not in the way of being followed. Though I had been followed, I had known since the last mountain road that something had tracked me through the night. Patient and unhurried, comfortable with the long distance. Not alone in a different sense. The ruins themselves were not empty. They had the quality of a space that is occupied by something that does not have a physical presence in the conventional sense, but that fills the available space with its attention, the way a large animal fills a clearing with its presence even before you see it. I went to the depression and did what the woman had told me to do. I will not describe this in detail either, not because it was too violent or too strange, though it was both of those things, but because the instructions were given to me in confidence, and what I used was not mine to share. What I will say is that it required something of me that was not metaphorical, that the transaction I was attempting to reverse demanded an equivalent transaction in the other direction, that what was given at the ruins in one direction had to be given back from the other direction, and that the currency was not something abstract. The entity was present. I felt it in the way I'd felt the wrongness in the air, amplified to a point that was no longer subtle, that pressed against the inside of my skull with a weight that was not painful, exactly, but that occupied the entire available space of perception, crowding out everything else. It was not angry. I don't think it experiences anger in the way we do. It was simply present, fully and completely, in a way that made everything else seem very far away and very small. I did what I had come to do. What happened next I experienced as a sound, though I don't believe it was a sound in the acoustic sense. It was more like the concept of a sound, the way you experience things in dreams that have qualities no waking sensation has. It moved through the ruins, and through the ground, and through me. And then it was gone, and the clearing was just a clearing, and the ruins were just ruins, and the air was just mountain air, cold and thin and entirely ordinary. I was on the ground. I don't know when I'd gone from standing to lying on the cold stone, but I was there, and getting up took a long time, and the drive down the mountain took even longer. Part 7. The aftermath. Elliot was found in the hospital that morning in his office, unconscious. He was taken to the intensive care unit of his own hospital, which had a quality of dark irony that I was too exhausted to fully appreciate at the time. His colleagues ran every test they could think of and found nothing specific. Nothing that explained the loss of consciousness or the quality of his vital signs when he was found, which one of the ICU nurses described to me later as like someone who's been very far away and just came back. The people in the hospital, the ones who had been changed by prolonged exposure to Elliot and to what was in him, recovered gradually. It was not instantaneous. It took weeks for some of them, longer for others, and a few of the most affected staff members left medicine entirely, citing reasons they clearly found difficult to articulate. The hospital as an institution survived. There were investigations, reviews, administrative restructuring. Nothing in any official report mentioned what had actually happened, because what had actually happened was not a category that official reports contain. Elliot regained consciousness. After 4 days, I was at his bedside when he woke up. He looked at me with his own eyes, the ones I recognized, and the recognition was mutual and genuine. And for about 30 seconds we were just two brothers in a hospital room, and the last year had not happened. Then he remembered. I watched it happen, watched the memory return in layers, and I watched his face change as each layer arrived. And by the time the last layer was in place, the expression had settled into something that was not the neutral blankness of the entity, but was not entirely what Elliot had been before either. He said my name. Then he said, "It's gone." Yes. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. I could feel everything it felt, he said. When it left, he paused. It was not what I expected. What did you expect? He didn't answer that. He looked at his hands lying on the hospital blanket, the same hands, and something moved across his face that I couldn't read. What happens now? He asked. They came for him 3 days later. The people the woman had told me about, the people whose job it is to deal with the aftermath of things like this. They were quiet, efficient, and they explained to the hospital administration that Elliot needed specialized care that they were equipped to provide, and the hospital administration was sufficiently shaken by the previous weeks to agree without extensive questioning. I was allowed to see him one more time before they took him. He was sitting in a wheelchair in the corridor, dressed in his own clothes, looking like himself and not like himself in a proportion I couldn't calculate precisely. He looked up when I came in, and his expression was the complicated one from the office, the one that occupied the space between anger and grief. "You could have told me," he said, "what it would cost. You wouldn't have listened." He considered this for a long moment, with the careful honesty that had always been his best quality, and then he nodded slightly. "No," he said, "I wouldn't have." I crouched down next to the wheelchair, so we were at the same level. "I'm sorry," I said, "for all of it, for driving you there, for not stopping you, for what I had to do to fix it." He looked at me for a long time with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life, one that I still cannot fully decode, that contained things I had no names for. "Take care of yourself." "Nate," he said. They took him away down the corridor, and I stood and watched until the corridor was empty, and then I went outside into the ordinary day and sat on a bench in the hospital courtyard and stayed there until the light. Changedepilog. I have been told that. Elliot is in a facility that I will not be given the address of, that he is stable and being studied, that the people caring for him are qualified, and that he is not in distress. I have been told these things by the woman who calls occasionally, who never says anything that isn't accurate, even when it isn't comforting. I have not been told whether what I did at the ruins was a complete success. I have asked, and I have received answers that are technically affirmative, and that leave room at their edges for a qualification that is never stated directly. That the entity is gone, yes. That the connection is severed, yes. That Elliot is free of it, yes. Whether free of it means entirely free of it is a question I have stopped asking because the answers I receive make me less comfortable than the not asking. The woman came to see me in person 3 months ago. She sat in my kitchen at the same table where Elliot had put the photograph down, more than 2 years ago now. She drank her coffee, and she asked how I was managing, and she was genuinely interested in the answer in the particular way of someone who's professional. Life requires them to be honest about difficult things. Before she left, she told me something she had been deciding whether to tell me for some time. She said the entity had been encountered before in its attempts to establish a foothold in our world, and that in every previous case the reversal of the original transaction had been complete, had severed the connection entirely, had left nothing behind. She said in Elliot's case, there was a small anomaly in the data they'd collected. Nothing significant. Nothing that would change the outcome or alter the prognosis. Just a small anomaly that they were monitoring. That she didn't want me to worry about it. That she would tell me if it developed into anything that warranted attention. I thanked her for telling me. I walked her to the door. I stood on my doorstep and watched her drive away, and I thought about what she hadn't said in the precise and careful way that she hadn't said it. And I went back inside and sat at my kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. Elliot's room is in a building. I will never be given the address of. The building has the kind of security that exists for things that need to be kept very safe in both directions. Not in the room Elliot sits. He eats, he sleeps, he speaks to the people who study him with the cooperative reasonableness of someone who understands his situation and has accepted it. He answers their questions. He participates in their tests. He gives them no cause for alarm. He has been a model subject since his arrival last week. One of the researchers noted in her log that Elliot had seemed, for a moment, to find something privately amusing. She'd asked what he was thinking about, and he'd said nothing, and he'd smiled. And she'd noted the smile in her log, because something about it struck her as worth noting, though she found it difficult to articulate exactly what. The smile did not reach his eyes. Dot in his eyes. Very deep, very small, almost impossible to see unless you were looking for it and knew exactly what you were looking for. There was something that had not been there before the ruins, and that had not gone away when everything else did. Something patient, something that had learned, across centuries of attempts, that the most important thing was not speed. Something that could wait. Nobody in the room noticed